Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 23 of the Current Review podcast. Today we have on David Greene, and he's an analyst at cars.com. Truly one of my favorite websites to look at car data. It's just a great website, and I think if you're looking to buy a car, I would go there first. So today we're going to talk about cars.com's big market report of 2024, which included just so much data from trends that they saw, and especially some EV information, because I know everyone is very fascinated with that. So first, I want to just talk to you. What are some big trends we saw in this past year? Because we're seeing some more affordable cars release. Like, I guess we can use a bunch of examples, even some more electric cars like the Equinox EV. But what are some of the key trends you've seen in 2024?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks so much for having me. And really, some of the big trends, affordability definitely shines through. And a big part of that is the average new car price. It's almost 50 grand. It's up 29% since 2019. So vehicles have just gotten more expensive, and it's sort of left behind some of the more vulnerable parts of the economy, right? 35% of new car buyers have a loan payment of $800 or more. That's about what the mix looked like 5 years ago for $600 or more. So it's just the mix of consumers with these expensive payments. It's really $800 is the new 600 is what we're saying. It's really gotten more expensive to get into a vehicle. So that's certainly part of what's driving things here. There's a lot of reasons why. Some of them are really big reasons, right? Regulations. That's definitely driven up costs, plus the shift to EVs and these higher vehicle prices. Manufacturers need to pay for the R&D and infrastructure to build out the EV system. So that's a piece of it. And then there's just the simple inflation. I mean, it's not just cars, it's everything has gotten more expensive in the last few years, and it happened really fast. So that's been pressuring everybody.
So would you say automakers are kind of offsetting their EV development costs by raising the price of gas vehicles in the meantime?
I'm not sure how much that's happening here in the USA. We know this is happening in Europe already. Automakers in Europe have already, publicly stated that they're raising prices raising prices on gas vehicles simply to encourage consumers in Europe to buy more EVs. So in the States, I don't know that that's happening. MSRP is sort of how we're used to thinking about sort of what a vehicle is worth, but then consumers are used to going to the dealership and negotiating a discount off MSRP. Before the chip shortage, nobody paid MSRP. That was crazy. But now it's sort of, everything got reset, and now a lot of consumers are sort of thinking more in terms of MSRP. However, automakers are starting to pull the incentives levers to discount certain vehicles, and that is sort of changing the pricing equation yet again.
Yeah.
And part of the reason for this discounting is simply just market normalization. There's more supply, there's more inventory, and so there's more competition. So that's a factor there. But in terms of actually raising prices to sort of pay for the EVs, I don't think so. I think that's generally sort of priced in already.
Cars are expensive now. You pointed that out earlier. About $50,000 is a new transaction price. Do you see consumer purchasing habits like shifting? Do we see more people buying used cars, or are they opting for leasing now? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a big topic. So consumers are going to buy what they can afford typically, and lenders are going to approve loans on what the consumer can afford. So a lot of times used vehicles are a great option for affordability, But heading into 25, we actually predict about a 7% decline in available inventory of
Really?
vehicles that are in that 0 to 6 year old range. The used cars that are, gently driven, not too many miles, pretty similar to new. And so that shortage is actually likely to change the market yet again. There's two ways this could play out, and I'm really not sure which way it's going to go. We could see that with that shortage, dealer margins get squeezed further because there's a ceiling on what they can charge for, say, a 3-year-old car, when there's a similar new car sitting on the same dealer lot that is already being discounted by the manufacturer. So if the cost base goes up because of the short supply, but new car pricing is sort of discounted, there's only so much room for a dealer to go there. And for a consumer, if I'm looking at a used car that is expensive and I don't have to pay that much more to get the new car, I'm probably going to go with the new car. Well, it could go the other way. It could actually inflate pricing across the board. We might actually see if used cars get a little more expensive, then both dealers and automakers recognize that they don't have to discount as much, and so it could actually bring new car prices up, but not in form of MSRP, rather in the form of negotiated price. So how much of a rebate is the automaker offering? How much is the dealer willing to negotiate on the final sale price? So, it's still hard to tell what's really going to happen here. It could go either way.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. At least with new vehicles, and we can kind of dive into electric cars a little bit. So you have the $7,500 tax credit, where we can maybe discuss the future of that in a little bit. But I think that really poses an interesting prospect for people buying new cars, and especially in states where you also get a state incentive. Is like Colorado, you get, I believe, a $6,500 state EV tax credit plus a $7,500 federal tax credit. So, I mean, right there, you're looking at an immense amount of money off MSRP on a brand new car. And that just means the used cars are going to have to be significantly cheaper for someone to buy a used EV versus a new one when you get such a massive amount of money off MSRP. So how does that affect used, I guess, EV prices in this example?
Certainly, the used value of an EV generally prices in all those tax credits. So an EV, what they call a residual value at the end of a lease term, or sort of the resale value when someone brings that vehicle back to market, it's basically going to already be offset by all those tax credit amounts. So it does mean that if you pay full price and don't get those tax credits, you're definitely going to feel the depreciation a lot more. However, most people are going to get the tax credit one way or another. And the reason for that is really so the federal EV tax credit is what I'll sort of focus in on, because that's available to everybody in every state if they qualify. It's a really complex law, the way it was written. If you're going to buy an EV, you've got to pick an EV that qualifies for the tax credit. So First off, it's got to be, it's got to have a certain amount of parts content from North America. It's got to be built, in either the USA or one of our free trade partners. So there's qualifications on the vehicle, and the vehicle price has to be below a certain value, which is different for a car or a truck. So it's already complex, but then throw in that the person buying it has to be below a certain income level, because they want to make sure that we're not giving free money to wealthier people that don't need it. However, in reality, they realized when they wrote the rules that it sort of left out some key qualifiers, and particularly businesses. So they created this leasing loophole that basically throws all those rules out the window. And if you lease, then it matters way less which vehicle you buy, and it matters not at all how much you make. So if you look at the lease rate in the past, just recent past, about 70% of EVs get leased compared to about 20% of gas vehicles.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's significant.
Yeah. So basically everybody's getting the tax credit one way or another, whether they're getting it through a purchase or they're getting it through sort of a really low lease payment. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of automakers right now offering lease deals on EVs for 2 years, which means there should be just a glut of supply in a couple of years for these vehicles. And it'll be real interesting to see what the values are like when they come back to market.
Yeah. Yeah, that's going to be very fascinating. And like, I know I wrote a post on this recently, so at least it was with Fiat. So the Fiat 500e in Colorado, when you basically added the state lease tax credit and then the federal lease tax credit, like your monthly payment on these cars would be $0 a month. All you'd have to pay is taxes up front. And so there's people in Colorado who are getting brand new Fiat 500Es on 2-year leases for effectively free. All they got to do is just pay the upfront taxes and obviously insurance. And this is just really interesting because there's a lot of people leasing cars or leasing EVs in general, as you mentioned, and some of these lease deals are incredibly affordable. So I'm just wondering what's going to happen in 2 to 3 years from now when we just get this massive influx of used EVs on the market. Are we going to see really low prices, or are people going to be more accepting of EVs by then and we could see prices stabilize? What do you think is going to happen?
My crystal ball is about as cloudy as everybody else's here. This could go so many ways. I think an important question to ask between now and then is what's going to happen to government policy, because the current administration is definitely they just rolled back CAFE rules. So gas engine vehicles are probably going to get more affordable, really. And so that could actually impact demand for EVs significantly. And then the administration is also talking about repealing a lot of the EV incentives. So a lot of the vehicle sales that we've seen recently, because if you think about it, the SAR has been incredibly strong for a few months. Q4 was the strongest sales month that we'd seen since the chip shortage started.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of these sales look like, it's hard to know, but they might be people that are simply buying ahead of price increases. Like they think, okay, it's going to get more expensive to get into a vehicle because either tax credits are going away or we could actually have more inflation from tariff policies. So, the auto market in 2 years could look very different depending a lot on what the administration does.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because I think there's so many ways that this could pivot out, because maybe we could see some of the incentives going away. But also maybe this is on a slightly different note. What do you think about interest rates? Do you see interest rates going down in the future? And obviously we could imagine that would probably spur some new and also used car sales, because I think the used interest rates are still really high.
Yeah, interest rates are another one where it's sort of tied in some ways to what the government decides to do with, some of these policies related to tariffs. Because if some of the things that they've been talking about come to pass, we could be looking at some significant price inflation, and the Fed might look at that and say, we're not going to cut rates. Not until inflation's under control, because that is part of their dual mandate, is control interest rates and control inflation. And they do that with interest rates. So, we saw the Fed cut interest rates 100 basis points, or effectively 1 percentage point, between September and December of last year. And, right now they haven't said, but they've hinted that they're just going to wait and hold and see what the data does. and that's how they'll make their decision on whether to cut rates or not. So in the auto sector, vehicle interest rates are not entirely tied to the Fed rate, because a lot of times manufacturers will subvent or subsidize the interest rates into lower rates so that they can use that as a sales incentive. We have been seeing automakers increase the incentive amounts, and we're not back to the days of 0% APRs. That hasn't returned. But we are seeing some really, really affordable lease pricing. And bringing that back to what I said earlier about, we're heading into a used supply shortage. Leasing is actually a potential lifeline here for consumers that are sort of struggling with their loan payments on the vehicle they currently have. And a lot of consumers are in that position because during the chip shortage, sort of in the mid 21 through sort of mid 2023 years, a lot of vehicle prices were highly inflated and a lot of consumers got into very expensive loans. But since then, used car values have come down a lot. And so the negative equity is very high. And that actually, cheap leasing deals that are going on currently and may continue, this could give consumers an option to get out of their negative equity because they could roll that into a lease payment that is affordable for them. So that's one way this could play out.
Yeah. And I know, especially with the prices when, like, during the chip shortage, when everything was very inflated, like, I know, like, my parents' neighbors, they bought a Tesla Model Y at the peak. So they spent like $67,000 for this Model Y. And now, obviously prices are way lower, but just a few months after they bought it, because they bought it towards, I think, the end of 2022, and then early 2023, Tesla dropped the prices. They got the tax credits. And I know there's a lot of people in these situations who bought really expensive cars during that peak period, and they might be on higher interest rate loans. And some people just have so much negative equity in their vehicles. It's really astonishing.
Yeah, it really is. And, I've definitely heard stories very similar to your parents and their Model Y. That's another place where, Tesla still owns the market for EVs. They're still the majority seller by far. And so when they take price actions, everybody else has to respond. And that's exactly what happened during that time period is their prices were high along with everybody else's, but they were sort of the first one to start dropping prices as soon as they could. And when that happened, it definitely impacted a lot of consumers, but it also sort of sent the used resale value of EVs into a tailspin as well. So that made it even harder for owners to get out of their vehicles. And I think we're finally starting to see a period as we head into 2025 where there might be some new options for those that are struggling with those payments.
Sure. And now you mentioned affordability earlier, and especially like if you poll people, like you're like, all right, do you want to buy an electric car? What's your biggest hurdle? They say price. We're seeing some more affordable options. I think like the Equinox EV is a great example of that. It's a car that's $35,000 and gets a $7,500 tax credit. So you're talking like $27,500 for a 300 plus mile range EV. Do you see this? I mean, it seems to have been doing relatively well. I'm sure you probably have more data on it than I do. But do you see more affordable EVs like this entering the market in the next few years?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure because automakers, they announce plans to bring vehicles to market and then they change them. So, it's not too late for them to back out if they feel like they can't be profitable on EVs. And a great example, it's not an affordable one in the same context, but we've already seen Ram has responded to the current administration's policies, right? The Ram Charger is coming before the Ram Rev. They canceled the long range Ram Rev. So we're already seeing moves like that happen. And if it seems like policies related to EV are going to change, and especially now that the CAFE targets have been cut, automakers might focus more on the gas vehicles because they can make those affordably a lot faster uh, than trying to do it on the electric side.
Yeah, interesting. Now, you bring up Ram. That's a really interesting one, or at least Stellantis, because I think the thing is, like, we can see the Ram Rev. It's just right now that electric pickup truck space is pretty cluttered. We got lots of options: Lightning, Silverado EV, Denali, all those. And then having another pure battery electric vehicle probably doesn't seem like the most logical step for Stellantis, which is not in the best shape right now. So I think that is probably a good strategic move to bring the Ram Charger first, just because it's a very unique concept. There is no plug-in hybrid electric pickup truck on the market right now. What do you feel about the Ram Charger, and do you think that would probably be a pretty big hit with customers?
I really do. It's going to be able to do things that those other electric trucks can't because of that range and the ability to fill up at a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
That's a game changer. If you think about drivers that want to go on a road trip to somewhere more remote, um, you have to plan really carefully for charging if you're in an EV. But if you don't have to worry about it and you can just fill up at any gas station or any EV charger, you're gold. You can go anywhere that any other vehicle can go. And it'll be real interesting to see how the real world towing performance is on that,
Mm-hmm.
because that's another area where electric trucks, they perform well, but the range takes a significant hit when towing. And if the Ram Charger solves for that too, and that will be a total game changer.
Yeah, interesting. Now, on a similar note with hybrids, I mean, we're seeing hybrids kind of become more popular. I think a great example is Toyota. Around, I think it was 47% of their new car sales in the United States are either electric or hybrid, or we could use hydrogen, but I think they only sold like 99 in quarter 3, so we can't really count that. But with hybrid cars, we're seeing customers get really interested in them. But I think the interesting thing about hybrids have been on the market for a really long time, and it seems like it's taking customers a really long time to kind of get accustomed to them, even though they're not that much different than pure ICE vehicles. What are some trends you're seeing with just regular hybrid vehicles?
It's funny you bring up Toyota. So in our latest industry report, we observed that 4 of the top 5 most searched hybrid vehicles on cars.com have a Toyota badge on them.
Really?
Yeah,
Is that
and
including like Lexus as well, or is that strictly Toyota?
that's strictly Toyota.
Wow.
And
Impressive.
of those 4 Toyotas, none of them are called Prius.
I would assume the RAV4 is on that list.
It is. Yeah,
Okay.
the RAV4 hybrid was on the list. So of these, though, I was surprised. It's actually the Land Cruiser that was at the top.
Ooh, okay, new one.
Yeah, new one. Yeah, so this is changing the hybrid segment completely, because essentially Toyota's put a hybrid in almost their entire lineup.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of changing how we have to look at hybrids. I mean, do we really need to segment hybrids away from other vehicles anymore? Or is a hybrid just a car at this point?
Yeah.
Now that the Camry's gone all hybrid, it's the best-selling car in America. It's probably going to stay that way. And now it's hybrid only. So the entire hybrid category is getting a massive lift in activity just because of that alone.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating to see what Toyota's been doing with just making a lot of their normal vehicles hybrids as standard. Because we see that with Camry, we also see that with Sienna, which is something that people, if you probably told someone like 15 years ago, like, oh yeah, the Sienna is going to be hybrid only, they probably wouldn't have thought that. But at least in my experience with Toyota hybrids, it's like I think they're a great middle ground between EV and gas, because I drive an EV myself, but for someone who's like not so technically inclined, you can operate a hybrid fine. It's going to just basically be like a gas car that just gets really good gas mileage and is really quiet at when you're driving under 30 miles per hour. So, I mean, I would probably be in the area to say that Toyota's hybrid numbers are probably just going to steadily increase. I mean, do you think they could probably reach over 50% of their own sales by next year?
Oh yeah, the Camry alone should do that for them.
Wow.
So yeah, I would definitely say they'll break through that point.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, just an interesting factoid. I got on NHTSA's website the other day just to do some research on the Camry, and saw that. All right, so we know the Camry is built in Kentucky. It's been the winner of the Cars.com American Made Index for several years, including 2024. And I was curious about the parts content of it. What percent of those parts are made in North America? And Camry is at 55% for a 25 model year.
Wow.
Compare that to Ford F-150, the number one selling truck. And that's only at 45%.
Interesting. That's just crazy when you think a Japanese hybrid sedan is actually more American made than probably one of the most quintessential American vehicles, which is a Ford F-150. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah, and that's where it's interesting to see just sort of the percent of sales of American-made vehicles by manufacturer. And Ford is actually, if you look at only the factories where they're building their vehicles, Ford is one of the most American manufacturers in terms of their production. But actually, so is Honda.
Wow. And then what about Tesla? Because I remember previously Tesla has always been pretty high up on that list. And I think number one spot for a few years, at least with Model Y and Model 3.
Yes.
How's Tesla doing now? Are they still pretty high up on the list?
Yeah. For the USA market, they're still building all their vehicles here that they're selling here.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, because I remember on the list, I think it was like a big shock. I forgot when it was, but it was several years ago, like probably like 2019 or something. And I remember when Tesla, the Model 3 was the number one most American made car, and people were like, people did not really, they probably didn't think the Model 3 was more American made than like an F-150, for instance, but it is really interesting.
Yeah, we've got a couple generations of mindset that if it's made in America, it came from Detroit, imported from Detroit. But these new automakers, Tesla and Rivian are the ones that come to mind. They're also American. They're just based in California.
Yeah, really fascinating. Now, I guess another topic I really was interested in talking with you about is when we see this hybrid versus EV shift. Hybrids are definitely rising in popularity. EVs are rising in popularity, but I mean they're around 10% of new car sales, and I think hybrids are around 10% as well. Where do you see these numbers going in 2025? Because I know obviously regulations could impact that a lot, like if we get rid of the tax credit, for example. But where do you think we could see these numbers going? Because I mean, definitely I see them increasing. But with EVs, I know there's talks of EV slowdown in terms of the growth. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is an interesting one. We're again sort of pontificating on the future with a tremendous amount of uncertainty of what if the government does this? What if they do that? What I can say already is that things have changed because EV sales took off in November. So if we sort of zero in on where that started, in November, it was all the coastal states. They started buying EVs in November, and that led to a big increase in EV sales. In December, EV sales continued to take off, but the rest of the country started buying more of them too. And in January, the final numbers haven't come in yet, but I expect more of the same. And so it truly looks like simply the threat of changing policies is encouraging more shoppers to buy EVs. And if we don't get any clarity on whether, if or when policies are going to shift, then this sort of pull ahead behavior might continue. And we might actually see EV sales continue to increase. And that could continue indefinitely. We don't know. Or it could taper back after enough sort of demand is saturated. But we also have seen from other studies that have been published regularly that once a consumer buys an EV, 7 out of 10 of them will buy another one. So it's got the highest loyalty rate of any sort of powertrain. It's incredibly high. So, and I think especially if you're a homeowner and you've invested in EV charging station, it just makes sense to get another one, whenever you're ready. So, merely the threat of repealing EV tax credits may have done all that and may have been a huge boost for the EV market.
Wow. Yeah, you touched on 2 points. I think the first is that is really fascinating that the threat of losing the tax credit is in itself making people buy more EVs. So as long as that period sustains, people are like, well, I better buy an EV soon so I don't lose the tax credit if I buy it later. That is really fascinating. And I guess as long as they're delaying with their talks of if they do want to repeal some portions of the Inflation Reduction Act or however they will go about doing that, that process in itself is spurring EV growth. That's very funny to think about.
Yeah, it really is. And, arguably, if this strings on long enough, then maybe the EV tax credit won't even be needed for the sector anymore if sales do well enough.
Yeah, that's funny. Now, the other point you mentioned, which was it was right after the tax credit. But if we're sorry, what was the one thing you mentioned? Sorry, it's hard without the video.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're talking about people that have invested in a home charger,
Yes.
or the high
So
loyalty.
you mentioned 70% of buyers are buying EVs again.
Yes.
Who bought their first EV. Now, the thing that I think is really interesting about this whole situation is if you buy an EV for the first time, you're already switching from an internal combustion engine vehicle. So just the loyalty with EV vehicle or with electric cars alone is really impressive. And I mean, 70%, like, is that even similar to some like luxury car brands like BMW? Like, are they even at 70% of customer retention?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but in general, luxury brands tend to have high retention based on their leasing programs.
Okay.
Once someone leases a car, they're highly likely to lease another one. Most lessees don't sort of turn in the car and say, okay, now I'm going to switch back to the ownership model of buying and getting a loan.
Mm-hmm.
And, traditionally luxury brands have leased at a very high percent, and that model works for them because then when the lease comes back, they certify it and sell off as their CPO program. And it's sort of a win for everybody. It brings affordability to luxury. But we also saw, starting a couple of years ago when the chip shortage hit, that lenders and manufacturers cut back heavily on leasing. And so that was a bit of a great reset, not just for luxury brands, but for the entire industry. And the vehicle shortages that we'd seen during that time period forced a lot of consumers to go with different brands because they couldn't find the car they wanted at the price they could afford in the brand they wanted. So that really changed consumer loyalty patterns and was a great disruptor. It'll be real interesting to see what happens to loyalty if consumers are willing to go back to the brands they wanted to buy before the chip shortage, and we see a reshuffling again, or if they tend to stick more with the brands that they tried out for the first time during the chip shortage. And it'll also be a great test of sort of dealer loyalty. I think a lot of times consumers remember quite well when they're only buying a car every 3 to 6 years or maybe less. They remember quite well which dealers treated them well, and
Mhm.
will they go back to that dealer since it's convenient and it's close to home, or are they going to switch dealers and potentially switch brands because of what's available in their area?
Yeah. Some of those dealers are brutal. Like that's the interesting thing about having a dealership model is you'll get a vastly different experience based on what dealer, because I remember during the pandemic, I was looking with my dad, we were just like checking out like an ID4, and they were like they didn't even want you to test drive it unless you were going to put down a deposit on it. They were like, you can't even test drive one if you're not going to put down a deposit on one right now. And it's like some of these dealerships, like just how not good they are, how poor they treat their customers just makes you not want to go to certain dealerships. And I I would suspect dealership loyalty is going to be a big thing. Just making sure you go to a place that is run by decent people.
That's so true. And there were definitely plenty of stories out there, because there's what, roughly close to 20,000, no, 30,000 franchise dealers, I believe,
Wow.
and then a ton more independents out there. Um, and so there's a ton of dealerships out there, and we hear all these stories about the dealerships that definitely had really aggressive tactics for their sales. What we don't hear as much of are the dealers that took care of their customers.
Yeah.
Uh, because if you had a good experience, it's hard to shout through that noise, and it's not something that goes viral. Um,
Mhm.
and if you had just sort of an average experience, mostly good, everything was fine, it's not something that people tend to even write reviews on.
Mhm.
We don't hear as much about that, but we definitely know there are plenty of ethical dealers that treated their customers well during that time. And I think as we move into the next buying cycle, that those consumers are going to remember that and go back to those dealers. So we're going to see a very interesting mix of um, dealer defection and loyalty as we get into this next buying cycle as consumers return to market.
Mhm. And then earlier, were you implying that customers were switching their brands based on the chip shortage? So if you were a loyal Mercedes customer and you wanted to buy a C class and they didn't have any in due to the chips, maybe they could have gone to a different automaker like BMW. So did that happen? Did you see that happen a lot during the early 2020s?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, there were dealer lots that were just empty. You couldn't find a car at some dealerships, or maybe they just didn't have a car that would meet your needs. You go to your local dealer and they're all out of SUVs, and you need an SUV. You
Mhm.
have to go to the next dealer over.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, those things were definitely happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely a really interesting time period just with the insane used car prices. Cause I remember during that period, I sold my Chevy Volt and ended up making money on it, which was pretty crazy. Like the idea that I put 5,000 miles on this car and ended up making something to the tune of $1,000, or sorry, $1 per mile I drove on the car because I made around $5,000 on it, was probably one of the craziest experiences of my life.
Yeah, I mean, what a success. You really timed that right. And the Volt, by the way, what a great car.
Yes.
I also have a Volt. I still have mine. And
Really?
yeah, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Great
What
vehicle.
year do you have?
2016.
Okay, that was the year I had too. Yeah, the Chevy Volt, I think, is one of the most underrated cars on the market. Okay, we can actually, I would like to talk about this a little bit. So, the Chevy Volt, I think, should have sold way better than it did. And it seems like, what do you think was your biggest, or what was the biggest issue in your opinion of the vehicle? Because I think it was kind of the marketing. Just people didn't really know all the Volt's capabilities. Because it's like, if you're cross shopping that in a Prius, it's like the Volt looks better, it's a lot quicker, it has really usable real world electric range that you can drive basically the car in electric only mode for most of your daily driving needs. What do you feel about that?
I think the Volt was ahead of its time, and that was
Yeah.
a big problem there. The first model year was what, 2011, and
Mhm.
the vehicle, it's a great vehicle. It was engineered to be bulletproof. It just holds up really well. And, it came out at a time when electric vehicles hadn't really taken off. A lot of people didn't have home chargers. The public charging infrastructure wasn't that great. And it was a lot of like new change that consumers struggled with. Why do I need to charge it? And getting people to understand that you can charge it and you can put gas in it, or you can do either one. It was just a lot of change. And part of it was the marketing and the messaging and getting consumer adoption. Part of it, I suspect that at the dealership level, it was a little bit difficult to sell because as a dealer salesperson, it was also new tech that they had to learn and figure out how to sell to consumers that didn't really understand the message and didn't understand the tech and weren't sure what to do with it. And, oh, by the way, we've got this gas-powered vehicle over here, that's similar to it. So, it was a much easier sell. And by the way, the price is lower. So, it was sort of, it was a challenge at sort of all levels. The ultimate demise of the Volt and the entire Voltec program, I think it really came sort of at a time when EVs were gaining a lot of momentum. And from the outside, it looks to me like GM was, challenged with selling the Volt, and EVs seemed like they were going to be sort of the more important direction for the company, and they have limited R&D and money to spend, and they had to redirect it. That's what it looks like.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate though, because it was like, still, I was even comparing it with like the new Prius Prime and the original Volt. It still has more electric only range. I think like a little bit lower gas fuel economy, but you drive in electric only mode most of the time. But yeah, that is, I think, one of the most important cars that is kind of that people don't really recognize that much. But do you see plug-in hybrids kind of taking off a lot more next year? Because we see so many plug-in hybrid options. Like even if you go to BMW's website, you see the 3 Series plug-in hybrid, 5 Series plug-in hybrid, X5, like so many plug-in hybrid options available. And are customers really buying the plug-in hybrids over the gas-powered ones in significant volumes?
I'm hoping to see a lot more growth out of plug-in hybrids. So far, as a category, plug-in hybrid sales have been a little bit soft, but I think we are seeing some growth. It's a little bit hard to be sure because of the available data is just not as strong on the powertrain breakouts. But I agree. I think plug-in hybrids are probably the most important category of a vehicle for all the reasons you mentioned. The other thing I'd like to see is a bit more range on the electric side for plug-in hybrids, because several of them, they have some range, but if you're only getting 20 miles of real world range in electric mode and then you're using gas, I'm not sure it justifies the cost premium of having that plug-in hybrid powertrain.
Yeah, because I remember, I think it was Wall Street Journal. They posted an article on the Lexus NX 450h, which is the plug-in hybrid one, versus the regular Lexus NX. And like, at least in that, it was like $14,000 more to get the NX plug-in hybrid as opposed to the gas-powered one. And then you get like, I forgot what the range was, but it wasn't that significant. It was like 30 to 35 miles of range, which is still good. You can still get somewhere in town. But like that cost premium is just a lot of money, 14,000. But then when you see some cars like the Prius Prime versus a Prius, and it's like $3,000 to $4,000 more, but you get like around 44 miles of electric range, that proposition's a lot more solid rather than some of these other options where you pay astronomically more money and then you get a little bit of EV range.
Yeah, and actually, to your point on the NX, there is the standard hybrid, the 350h, and the cost premium between a hybrid and a plug-in hybrid is also quite significant on that model. So in a lot of cases, the plug-in hybrid may not pencil out. And so getting a little more parity, no matter what model we're talking about, more parity between the gas hybrid and plug-in hybrid will help a lot. And circling back to what we talked about at the start, Europe. So automakers are raising the price of their gas-only vehicles to create that parity. Don't really want to see that happen here. We want to see affordable options here, which means we're hoping that on the cost side, automakers can find some room to bring those prices down rather than the other way around.
Yeah, totally agree. And as we start to wrap up this conversation, I would love to ask you a big question, and that is, we talked about some trends early on this episode that you noticed in 2024. In the next few years, do you see any big general trends, I guess, regardless of what happens with the federal government? But I mean, are there any big trends, whether it's new market, used market, in the next few years arising?
So EVs are here to stay, no matter what happens with regulations. The EV sector is simply growing. And like we talked about, that high loyalty rate of EVs, the demand is only going to continue increasing. Not only is it owners that love to buy another EV once they've had one, but their friends and family are getting exposure to that vehicle. And so that opens up their consideration. And so as we've seen EV sales grow in a few years, we're going to see used EV sales grow too. Now, currently in the used EV space, Tesla is the number one player. And that is largely because they've been the number one seller of EVs in the new market. So they've got the most inventory returning and they've got the brand. But in the used space, it's more recent that we're seeing this great expansion of offerings from other automakers. And so in the used EV market, we're going to see other brands start to be a lot more competitive as more of those EVs return to market for the used space. Also, we predict 2025 is going to be sort of the most severe shortage of that 0 to 6 year old used vehicle inventory. And then it's going to improve after that. The reason for the shortage is that there were fewer new cars sold, and the percent of leases in the last few years has come down ever since the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, a little over 3 out of 10 new vehicles were leased, and a typical lease is 3 years. So it's a pretty reliable 3-year return to market time period. And so as the pandemic hit and the chip shortage hit and credit markets changed, that mix of leasing dropped down to closer to 20% for a while there. And so a lot fewer vehicles were leased, which gives you less of a steady supply of used inventory returning to market. And this is sort of the most impacted year, but it's going to start loosening again next year. And improve after that. So we'll see affordability in the used market sort of improve starting in 26 and continue after that.
Well, that's exciting to see some more, hopefully seeing affordability improve across the board. That would be really nice to see.
Yeah. Now, the other sort of unknown factor there is because of a shortage in sort of that late model year used supply, a lot of consumers have already been sort of holding and keeping their vehicles longer and maintaining them more to keep them running. But that could sort of trickle down to a shortage of older, say the sub $10,000 vehicle market. And so that could actually sort of slow the price and affordability easing for a year or two. So it may have some, trickle back delays.
Interesting. Well, that all sounds really fascinating, and I'm really excited to see where the market's going to go in the next few years. And I mean, we could even shorten that period to the next several months to see what happens with the administration and what's going to happen. Because I have a feeling that a lot of stuff's going to be very different in the next maybe a year, but I don't know. We will see.
I'm actually most interested in finding out what's going to happen with gas prices with some of the new administration policy changes. Simply, I mean, it's not really clear what they're doing with CAFE, whether they're going to change the targets or hold them at where they're at now. But that's the one side. And then, the president has also definitely hinted at approving more oil drilling. But North American oil isn't really what's typically refined into gasoline. So, it'll be real interesting to see what sort of policies emerge from that and whether gas stays the same. Does it get more affordable? Does it get less affordable? A lot of that is international relations that are way above my pay grade, but really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's going to be very interesting next few months. And I guess regardless, thank you very much for sharing your insights today. I learned a lot from you, and I think it just proves that there is so much more going on underneath the surface of the automotive market that a lot of people probably give credit to. So thanks to you and your research. It helps consumers out a lot.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the conversation.